Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is October the 1st. We're at the Congregation of Yahweh, Panama City, Florida. Welcome. Wish you were here. It's a beautiful day. It's cool. And the autumn is upon us. Well, today I'm going to talk about the aspects of biblical and modern debt. Debt is an obligation, and there's various kinds of debt. And some are mentioned in the scriptures. But almost everyone knows about debt. Modern English Bible versions contain words from Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. And modern versions are based upon the commonly available Bible, widely available Bible. The first one was the 1611 edition King James Version Bible, frequently called the 1611 KJV. In the 1611 KJV and in modern versions, you will find frequently that an English word, the same English word, is used in various contexts to refer to words in the manuscripts which have multiple meanings. An example of such words are debt, debtor, debtors, and debts. There are 18 verses in Strong's Hebrew and Greek dictionary which mention debt, debtor, debtors, and debts, plural. The four words which correspond to 11 definitions found in the Hebrew and Greek structures. So you have four words, four English words. These four English words I mentioned have 11 different definitions in the Hebrew and the Greek. And I'm going to go over these real quickly so that you can see that although the words are similar, they're not exactly the same. Now, the kinds of debt in biblical times are different, greatly different from the ones which we have today. But in many instances, they're similar. So let's turn to 1 Samuel, verse 22:2. We're going to begin at 22:1. Now this is a story of David, about David. And they told David, saying, Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors. These are people who, the threshing floor was where grain was separated from the stalks. Therefore David inquired of Yahweh, saying, Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And Yahweh said to David, Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. And David's men said to him, Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. Wait a minute. Excuse me, dear. Excuse me, folks. Go to verse 22:2. David therefore departed. Start all over. David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves to him, and he became captain over them, and they were with him about 400 men. So you had people who owed a debt, and for whatever reason, they were angry about it. And so they joined themselves to David, perhaps in expectation of not having to pay the debt off. Well, the word debt there is Strong's 5378, and it's nashal. And it goes to the idea of lending on interest. By implication, a person being dunned for the debt. So it appears that these people are being done for the money that they owed. Go to 2 Kings 4:7. We'll begin at 4:1. Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, saying, Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared Yahweh, and the creditor has come to take to himself my 2 children to be bondmen. And Elisha said to her, What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, Your handmaid has nothing in the house save a pot of oil. And then he said, Go, borrow you vessels abroad of all your neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And you shall go in and shut the door on you and on your sons, and pour out into all those vessels, and you shall set aside that which is full. So she went from him and shut the door on her and her sons, and they brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass that when the vessels were full, that she said to her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And they said to her, There is not a vessel more. And the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of Elohim, and he said, Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you shall live, and your sons shall live. This is an example of financial debt. It's not a moral obligation. It's a moral obligation to pay the debt, but it is a financial debt. And she has now been given the means by which to pay that debt. And there's a lesson here. The lesson is, if you are in debt, personal debt, one of the things that works most of the time is to go and sell everything you have, pay off the debt. Sometimes it's impossible. Sometimes one doesn't have things. But what is being mentioned here, the principle is that the creditors were going to take everything she had, including she and her sons. So it's very serious. Let's go now to Nehemiah 10:31. And if the peoples of the land bring wares or any grain on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy of them on the Sabbath or on a holy day, and that we would forego the 7th year and the extraction of every debt. What he's saying here is that they would not collect that interest or from loans which in the 7th year, and neither would they buy nor sell, of course, anything on the Sabbath day or on a holy day. Well, the holy days are coming up, so it probably was about this time of the year. But the word, the definition there is Strong's 3027, and the word is yad, Y-A-W-D, and it means a creditor, custody, debt, a debt order, draw with strength, and of course it meant the forego of debt in the 7th year. So there could be no buying and selling on the Sabbath day. There could be none on an annual Sabbath day, which is another way to call the feast days, and there could be no collection of debt during the 7th year. Matthew 18:27. We'll begin at 18:23. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven like unto a certain king who would make a reckoning with his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought to him that owed him 10,000 talents. But since as he had not with which to pay, his master commanded him to be sold, and his wife and his children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. And the servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. And the master of the servant, being moved with compassion, released him and forgave him of the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 shillings. And he laid hold of him and took him by the throat, saying, Pay what you owe. So his fellow servants fell down and supplicated him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay you. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison till he should pay that which was due. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were very sorry, and they came and told the master all that was done. Then the master called him to him and says, You wicked servant, I forgave all your debt, because you supplicated me. Should not you also have mercy on your fellow servant, even as I had mercy on you? And his master was angry and delivered him to the tormentors till he should pay all that was due. So shall also my heavenly Father do to you, if you forgive not everyone his brother from your heart. Now, this is a parable. And the message is although it talks about financial matters, items, what it really is a moral teaching. If you must forgive somebody in your mind, not just monetarily, because you won't be forgiven if you don't forgive others. Matthew 18:30. Now this is Strong's 3784, and the word is aphelo, and it means to owe, to be under obligation, ought, must, should, morally, to fail in duty, behoove, be bound, be guilty, indebted, owe. So we'll go to 18:30. I'm sorry, we were just there, and we were through 18:32. Romans 4:4. Romans 4:4. Now this is in the Greek, so it'll be from the Greek New Testament in Strong's, Greek dictionary in Strong's, and it's Strong's 3783, and the word is O-F-I-L-A-Y-M-A-H, and it means something owed, figuratively, something due, morally, a fault, or a debt. So you have similar types of definitions in both the Hebrew and the Greek for these different words. So let's turn to Romans 4:4. The subject of the debt, as I said earlier, is everybody knows what debt is, but the consequences for debt, it's something that most people don't consider, don't think about. Well, we're going to review some of the consequences of modern debt today. Romans 4:4 will begin in verse 4. Now to him that works, the reward is not reckoned as of grace, but as of debt. Again, the meaning was something owed, figuratively something due, morally a fault, a debt. Again, now to him that works, the reward is not reckoned as of grace, but as of debt. But to him that does not work, but believes on him who justifies the wicked, his faith is reckoned for righteousness. Even as David pronounced blessing upon the man to whom Elohim reckons righteousness apart from works, saying, Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Now we're going to look up the word debtor. We'll start with Ezekiel 18:7. And we'll begin in verse 5. But if a man is just and does that which is lawful and right, and has not eaten upon the mountains, neither has lifted up his eyes to idols of the house of Israel, neither has defiled his neighbor's wife, neither has come near to a woman in her impurity, and has not wronged any, but has restored to the debtor his pledge, has taken nothing by robbery, has given his bread to the hungry, and has covered the naked with a garment. He that has not given forth upon interest, neither has taken any increase, that has withdrawn his hand from iniquity. To begin with, the things that we can relate to, let's take one for example. Restored the debtor his pledge. We frequently see pictures of a biblical person having a white tunic, for example, and will have a cloth hanging over his arms, draped over his shoulders, and usually down the other side. It was also the custom of the Romans. Now that cloak was an important garment to the individual. Why? Well, first of all, in desert countries, at night it gets quite cold. And so the person would lay it down, put his feet approximately in the middle, and then fold the other half over the top of it. So he would lay on something kind of soft, thin, and he would be covered with something that was somewhat insulative. If he went out and he was working in the field and he was going to stop for a meal in the field, he would usually lay it down and then sit on it, much like we would a picnic blanket. So this was important and dear. So when a person would use it as surety, as a pledge for a payment of debt, it was a serious matter to him. If the creditor didn't return the cloak, the person conceivably could die. Well, the lesson here is that the person's life is worth more than the garment. So give it back to him at night, and in the morning, probably would take it back up again until the debt was paid. Now we'll go to the word debtor, and we'll turn to Ezekiel 18:7. If I can find it. We're going to begin in verse 5. But if a man is just and does that which is lawful and right, and has not eaten upon the mountain, I'm sorry, I just read that verse, excuse me. Luke 7:41, excuse me, Luke 7:41. begin in verse 1. No, I'm sorry, 7:40. A certain lender had two debtors. The one owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they had not with which to pay, he forgave them both. Which of them, therefore, will love him the most? This was kind of a little test question. One owed twice as much as the other. Would he love the person that forgave the debt twice as much as the other one who owed lesser amount? So this was kind of to cause people to think that he forgave them both, irrespective of how much money was owed. Let's go to 16:3 in that same book. We'll begin in verse 1. And he said to the disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and the same was accused to him that he was wasting his goods. And he called to him and said, what is this I hear of you? Render the account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. And the steward said within himself, what shall I do? Seeing that my master takes away my stewardship from me, I have not the strength to dig, i.e. gardener or farmer. To beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. And calling to him each one of his master's debtor, he said to the first, how much do you owe on to my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said, take your bond and sit down and write quickly 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he says to him, take your bond and write 80. And his master commended the unrighteous steward, because what he had done was done wisely. For the sons of this world For the sons of this world, for their own generation, wiser than the sons of light. Again, this is a parable. A lot of people forget that these things are parables. And they're meant to teach, and they're meant to cause the hearer to think. Because at the service, the average person would say, well, what business does he have giving away his master's goods? Giving them away by reducing the amount that was owed. But again, the lesson is mercy. The lesson is mercy. Let's turn to Galatians 5:3. Getting to the end here. Yes, I testify. I'm going to begin at verse 1. For the freedom the Messiah set us free. Stand fast, therefore, and be not entangled again in the yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, say to you that if you receive circumcision, the Messiah will profit you nothing. Yes, I testify again to every man that receives circumcision that he is a debtor to the whole law. If a person were baptized, if they sincerely repented, made a sincere, as Catholics would say, act of contrition, and were baptized, they were baptized, and therefore they had to obey the law. That was, after all, one of the reasons. So turn to Romans 8:1. begin in Romans 8:1. And now therefore, there is therefore now no condemnation to them that are in the Messiah Yeshua. For the law of the Spirit of life, the Messiah Yeshua, made me free, and the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, that it was weak through flesh, Yahweh sent his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, condemning sin in the flesh, that the ordinance of the law might be fulfilled in us who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. For they that are after the flesh mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit mind the things of the Spirit. For the mind of the flesh is death, but the mind of the Spirit is life and peace. Because the mind of the flesh is enmity against Yahweh, for it is not subject to the law of Yahweh, neither indeed can it be. For they that are in the flesh cannot please Yahweh. But if you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if so be that the Spirit of Yahweh dwells in you, but if any one does not have the Spirit of Messiah, he is none of his. And if the Messiah is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. But if the Spirit of him that raised up Yeshua from the dead, the Spirit of him that raised Yeshua from the dead, Yahweh, shall give life also to your mortal bodies through the Spirit that dwells in you. So then, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh, to give after flesh. For if you live after flesh, you must die. But if you put your deeds, the deeds of the body, to death by the Spirit, you shall live. He's talking about eternal life, and he's talking about an obligation here. That if these people followed Paul's preaching, they cannot return to worshiping idols. Worshiping idols was something of the flesh. Well, that's sort of a redundant review of some of the things in the Scriptures under the heading of debtors, and debts, plural. Well, mankind is forever in Yahweh's debt. And most people would agree that mankind deserves annihilation because of sin. Yet, Yeshua's life exemplified mercy. And in his preaching, he preached mercy. And throughout the verses and so forth that I've read, we have seen examples where in the nation of Israel, mercy was granted to those every 7 years with the forgiveness of debt and the return of their land to tribal lands. But the lesson that comes through clear from our Savior is that for we to have our debts forgiven morally, we must forgive others first. As we've seen in the verses, the debts can be both moral and financial. The examples are given. But in a larger sense, Yeshua's message was national mercy. And as I said, the forgiveness of debts and the restoration of land is an example, in the seventh year, is an example of mercy extended to the people. The obligation to pay one's debts occurs throughout history. The consequence of not doing so, as you could tell from the readings, could result in beatings, imprisonment, being sold as slaves, and even death. The consequence of not being able to pay a debt included indentured servitude of a debtor and sometimes his family. Other consequences later on in the Middle Ages and so forth included the debtor being put in a debtor's prison until his debt was paid off. He couldn't pay his debt before he was put in prison when he had an opportunity to work to pay it off. He's now thrown in prison. And so it is his family who has the burden to pay his debt, in addition to the burden to sustain him, clothing, food, and so forth. The state didn't feed him. Well, it was unfair. It was grossly unfair. But the fact of the matter is it was done. It's in history. Today, the wisdom of Yahweh's inspired word and the history about the dangers of debt has been largely ignored by those entrusted with national governance. So now I'm talking about modern debt. And what I'm going to talk about next is sovereign, state, municipal, and agency debt. And I know this is not totally scriptural, what I'm going to say, but it is factual. About 15 years ago, there was a pamphlet given out at a graduation of the class at Gulf Coast State College. And the title of the pamphlet was "The Black Plague of Debt." And the author mentioned various kinds of debt and stressed the avoidance of it. He did so because of the dire personal and consequences and the dire national consequences. He mentioned that the paths to a debt trap are very inviting. One can easily slip into a debt trap through personal uncollateralized loans such as payday loans, cash advances, credit cards, and so forth. One can also slip into a debt trap through personal collateralized loans, such as auto loans, in which case the vehicle is the collateral, home equity loans, the house, the domicile is the collateral, mortgage loans, same thing. The author warned about some of the consequences of modern debt, and he mentioned personal default through bankruptcy, the potential default of defined benefit plans, corporate, municipal, and state bonds. Now this mention of the default of personal retirement plans, of defined benefit retirement plans. You've got two things. You've got defined savings plans, in which case a person who's working can elect to have the money put into an IRA, can be a self-directed IRA. There's many different options that are available to a person. And you have defined benefit plans. Years ago, much less so today, but years ago, you could go to work for, say, Boeing. And you would, when you walked in the door, first day and started, you would become a member of the defined benefit plan. So after you had been there a certain amount of time, and then you qualified, you became vested, then you would accumulate retirement benefits. And at the end of your work stint, when you retired, you would be paid so much a month. What has happened is that corporations have raided these defined benefit plans, raided the money that was supposedly set aside. The number of defined benefit plans which are underfunded is significant. It's about half. So that means that about half of the people are not going to get their defined benefit. Well, you can have default of corporate bonds. You can have default of municipal bonds. People might remember that years ago, Orange County in California defaulted on their municipal bonds. You can have default of state bonds. Now, usually the governor, people who are governed will make maximum effort to pay these off, because if they default and it goes on record, they can never borrow again at a decent rate. Sad to say, but everything that was in the pamphlet seems like it's been ignored. But perhaps the worst debt that was mentioned in the parable is the one that I'm going to address now, and that is sovereign debt. Almost all nations have sovereign debt. Some countries have much more sovereign debt than others. The amount of sovereign debt that a country has is frequently expressed as a percentage of that country's gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total value of all of the goods and services for 1 year from a country. And it is used as, it's an estimate, and it's what is used by creditors who are considering the purchase of sovereign bonds from a given country. It's used as a metrics. In other words, if a country has a very large GDP and very low sovereign debt, the risk is of the bonds being defaulted is low. However, there are countries right now which have a ratio greater than one. And yet, believe it or not, they're still able to sell the bonds. The interest rate is quite high, but they're still able to sell the bonds. Now there's some examples of sovereign bonds that bear looking at. They commonly have maturities of 5, 10, 15, or 30 years. And 30 years was called the long bond, and it was the standard bond that everybody talked about. But now, sovereign bonds from at least one country are being sold with a 50-year maturity. 50-year maturity. Now, all sovereign debt is a burden on future generations. It's a burden that's placed upon them without their permission, without their knowledge. Most aren't even born yet. And the people who are causing this to happen will be long gone and dead. So the things that the evil that they do, it lives on after them. Most bonds pay interest annually. Some bonds pay zero interest. You may have heard them called zero interest bond. Well, they don't pay any interest until the date of maturity, and then all of it comes due. The interest rate of a bond depends upon the risk that a potential creditor is willing to assume. Creditors can be you and I. We can go to Merrill Lynch, for example, and ask to have our IRA deductions or I guess cash or put into a bond fund. Well, the bond fund consists of a big family of bonds, some municipal, some corporate, some sovereign, and so forth. So you may be an unknowing participant of these bonds. The chief risk is default of a country to pay its sovereign bonds. Ordinary person would say, how likely is that? I mean, really, a country not paying its bond? Well, it's happened, and I'll mention a few. The other risk that can happen to a creditor who's considering investing in a bond fund or buying bonds straight out is currency devaluation. Currency devaluation. So you might go in and purchase a bond that has a very nice rate of return, interest rate, and suddenly find out that the currency of that country has been devalued, so you get nothing. Well, there's a situation now in the PIGS, and that's an acronym that stands for Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. PIGS. Default on the payment of sovereign bonds was recently occurred in Argentina and Venezuela. Now, you may remember from the news just a few years ago that it took the European Central Bank to lend these countries money in order that they would not default, so they could pay their civil servants and so forth and so on. That's kind of like the bank of last resort. Above that bank is another bank. It's called the International Monetary Fund. So what happens is that a little neighborhood bank is just a business. It's like Western Auto or Kentucky Fried Chicken. It's a business. The next tier above that are banks, which are agencies, or maybe agencies of the federal government. Beyond, say, for example, the federal government or European governments, is the International Monetary Fund. Well, Puerto Rico just defaulted on their sovereign bonds. We know Puerto Rico. It's sort of like a territory of the United States. They defaulted on their sovereign bonds, on the payment of their sovereign bonds. When the payment came due, they didn't do it. They didn't pay. Most of those bonds, it turns out, were owned by hedge funds. And so a lot of people said, well, so what? The hedge fund managers were smart enough to know what they wanted to do. When they bought these bonds, they were attracted by a high interest rate, and okay, they defaulted. It's not our problem. Well, it isn't, but bonds which have bonds which are municipal issue, that is Panama City, for example, bonds, say, from the state of Florida, bonds which are secured by a revenue stream, bridge tolls, things of that nature. These things have a call on the general revenue of the entity that's selling the bonds. But the bonds that are sold on the basis of revenue from tolls don't have that call unless it's so stated. Their revenue stream comes from tolls. Well, if the number of tolls increases, then it's perfectly fine. You know, it's a good investment. Right here in Panama City, the bridge over the Hathaway Bridge was going to be a toll bridge. Not many people know it, but it was going to be a toll bridge. I attended one of the meetings, and the person, an attorney here in town, had a big drawing and so forth, and he was talking about buying these bonds. And he said, for all practical purposes, the bonds are already sold. He said, because we have a 50-cent sweetener in the second year. What he was saying is while they would charge you 75 cents to go either way over the bridge, in the second year, the toll would go up 50 cents. So the people working at the Navy lab were suddenly going to be stuck with this and had no knowledge of it whatsoever. It turns out that was, it was just a public relations thing. The bridge down near Pensacola, the bonds for the bridge, free bridge, state bridge, the bond sold out in 14 minutes. I'm talking many $million-dollar bond issue, sold out in 14 minutes. So there was no need for a sweetener or any of these gimmicks except to line somebody's pocket. And incidentally, the bonds were not available. The Hathaway Bridge bonds were not available because they had already been subscribed. The bonds had not even been approved to be issued, and they were already spoken for. At the present time, the sovereign debt the United States owes is more than $19.5 trillion. Now, I know you've heard this. $19.5 trillion. That's 19 with 12 zeros behind it. And the national debt is growing every second. Yep. Every second. Not included in the national debt number are the financial obligations from so-called off-budget items such as Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, etc., government pensions. These obligations are being paid now and are to be paid into long into the future. Now, I mention these because a business cannot run their books that way. You cannot have off-budget items, off-book items, There cannot be obligations which are not reflected in the statement. I mean, these people ought to be arrested and thrown under the jail for this kind of... In other words, there should be somebody that has the guts, the intestinal fortitude, that's guts, to stand up and say, hey, we're going to have good accounting or no accounting. Period. Well, the national debt alone, not including these other obligations, portends dire financial consequence for the average person, not only in America, but the rest of the world. There's people that haven't given a thought to this in this country and in many, many places of the world. The consequences of sovereign debt exist because the U.S. dollar has been debased by previous administrations. The U.S. dollar is not now backed by gold or any precious metal. And the last time silver was used in coinage of this country was in 1965. 1965. I know a guy one time worked for the Federal Reserve, and his job was to bag coins. And after the laminated coins came about, people still had silver coins. They would come in, and he would separate them. He went to his boss, and he said, I'd like to buy $5,000 in quarters. And the boss said, well, why? And he said, it's legal U.S. tender. I got $5,000 here. Can I buy them? He said, sure. He said, that's a lot of weight. What are you going to do with it? He said, well, I'm going to ask you to lend me a guard, and I'm going to roll it across the street on a handcart to the Hibernian National Bank and put it in their vault in my account. And the guy said, sure, I'll let you have the guard. I'll give you two. Help you roll that thing, because Joe was kind of a little short guy. And so they did. He gave him a cashier's check for $5,000. They loaded up $5,000 in junk coins, that's worn coins, rolled it across the street to the Hibernia Bank, and put it in the vault. And Joe was telling me that his boss laughed at him. He said, oh, man, you must be crazy. You must be crazy. He said, you could put the $5,000 in the bank and earn interest. Now, in those days, we had double-digit inflation in this country. And so from his point of view, this was what he was doing was crazy. Well, each one of those bags, this is $1,000 bag, each one of those bags, $1,000 coins in it, 720 troy ounces of silver, within a year became worth $22,000 each. So it cost him $1,000, and within a year, each one of them was worth $22,000 each. Now, there's precedent for the destruction or the debasement of U.S. coinage and the coinage of other countries in a publication that examined the coinage from Rome. And what they found was that as the coinage was debased, the power of Rome diminished. There's a lesson there. The same thing can happen here. Now, there are probably some who will hear this message who will remember that At one time in this country, gold ownership was prohibited. This happened under FDR's administration. And the federal government went around and collected, that's a kind word, people's gold and gave them $35 per ounce in paper units. That single act sowed the seeds of distrust. Sowed the seeds of distrust in the government's present financial situation and their ability to do anything effective about it. That distrust has grown ever since. Well, at the present time, the ownership gold is once again allowed. The so-called smart money is buying it. They're taking physical delivery of it, and they're hiding it. Countries like China and Russia are buying 400 to 600 tons, troy tons, each year, metric tons, each year. Production from their own mines, and both countries have gold mines, cannot be sold outside of the country. The government of each one of these countries buys every ounce that's produced. The amount of gold that can be mined economically is less than the present worldwide demand for it. Proof. Call up a gold supplier and say, I want $100,000 worth of gold ingots in 1 ounce. In 1 ounce. They'll probably say, well, it'll take us 3 months to fill that order. Why? Because they got to dig out that gold and make it into ingots. It's not like at a grocery store where when you run out of lettuce, you go into the back freezer and you pull out another box of lettuce. There's none there. It's based upon whatever is coming out of the ground. The U.S. government is reported to have 7,400 tons of gold in Fort Knox. But one can see that in 10 or 15 years, China and Russia will equal that amount at the rate that they're buying it. U.S. has not bought precious metals to keep up with the growth of China and Russia, nor to back up the trillions of dollars printed under quantitative easing. If there ever was a curse word, that's got to be it. Because quantitative easing was nothing other than printing of fiat paper dollars based on nothing. Toilet paper is worth more. Toilet paper is more essential. Precious metals retain their intrinsic value. Value can go up and down, but they got value. Countries cannot print more of it. What you got is what you've got. But the money that was printed under quantitative easing, and I'm talking trillions here, under the Obama administration, $6.5 trillion was added to the national debt. That fiat money is no different from Confederate dollars all over again. No different whatsoever. It's not backed by anything. If confidence is lost, you can build a bonfire in the backyard. Keep warm with it.
It doesn't burn that good.
In a dire worldwide economic disaster, will history repeat itself in this country as regards the confiscation of precious metals? Now, why would I make a statement like that or ask the question? The question is because nobody will want the paper units called dollars. They'll want something with intrinsic value. So you got to ask the question, Why are national and international governmental leaders not voicing concern about the consequences of national debt? They all seem to want to not face the reality of financial disaster instead of addressing the problem. Have you ever noticed in any of the news stations, you don't hear either of the candidates, none of the candidates, talk about how they're going to pay the national debt? Has anybody heard it? Hold up your hand. Nobody. Well, there are several reasons for not addressing the problem. The average person who elects leaders has no idea how large the national debt is. In fairness to the average person, who can be concerned about something they don't understand? After all, as long as things are satisfactory in day-to-day activities, the assumption is it will continue on unabated. Well, up to this point, I can assure you that what was in those pamphlets has been, and surely looks like it will continue to be ignored. Why is no one railing about the impending consequences of a loss of faith in the U.S. dollar worldwide? Part of the reason is that most, but not all countries, are worse off as far as the debt to GDP ratio than is the United States. As big as our debt is, their ratio is higher. But some countries have been slowly getting rid of dollar reserves in their central banks. This is noted in the steadily reduced monthly purchases of U.S. sovereign debt. China, for example, has cut down their purchases down to maybe 2 or 3%. You can see graphs of it gradually coming down. Now, they're still buying a little of it. Why? Because this country is paying interest. It's not true of Europe and other places. Additionally, the United States is seen as the payer of last resort. And one of the things that we do in this country is pay interest. You might say, so what? What's the big deal of that? Scandinavian countries, Japan, and some other European countries now charge negative interest on savings deposits of depositors. Negative interest. The news, listen for that phrase, negative interest. Well, why would anybody put their money on deposit in a country that took money out of the amount that's deposited? The idea of negative interest rates was put forth. That's an idea. Some so-called economists come up with this thing. Well, if we charge people interest on their savings, they'll go out and spend the money, and that will boost the economy, and that will boost tax revenue, and we can pay off these sovereign debts. Wrong. Didn't happen. And it isn't happening. It's not stimulating the economy. The idea, in fact, has had opposite effect. In Japan, many people are drawing out their savings out of financial institutions, and it's happening in other countries where there are negative interest rates. The Federal Reserve chairwoman has said that the idea of negative interest rates in this country is not off the table here. Friends, that's something that people ought to be cognizant about. They ought to be on this subject like nothing is more important. Japan is the country that's offering negative interest sovereign bonds with a 50-year maturity. Why would anybody buy them? Yet, the fact is, they are actually selling. Well, it makes no investment sense, but it's happening. The U.S. dollar is a reserve currency of most of the world. This stems from the Bretton Woods Agreement, in which the Saudis required payment for their oil in U.S. dollars. In exchange, the U.S. agreed to defend Saudi Arabia. But China and Russia are now actively pushing their own currency in an international transaction to avoid first converting their currency into U.S. dollars. They're doing this because many of the U.S. dollars in existence are in the vaults of various international central banks, not here. This quantitative easing and all this fiat money is in banks worldwide, more than here. So what's happening is that the Bretton Woods Agreement is losing its effectiveness because Russia is now a large exporter of petroleum as Saudi Arabia. So China and Russia are selling stuff back and forth and not converting it to dollars as most of the rest of the world must do. But the percentages of dollar-denominated transactions has been dropping, even though the strength of the dollar has been high in recent years. So the power of the United States will gradually diminish as these transactions cease to be converted first into dollars. Although it is said that the central bankers are becoming disenchanted with the dollar, the fact of the matter is we're the only game in town. They don't have much in the way of alternatives. Well, getting to the end here. How big is $1 million? How big is $1 billion? How big is $1 trillion? Average person has no idea how much space $1 million, $1 billion, or $1 trillion requires. If one stack $1 trillion in $1,000 bills, the same thickness as a $1 bill, except it's just got more zeros behind it. If you were to stack it, one on top of the other, it would be 63 miles high, plus or minus a foot. 63 miles high. In $1 bills, the stack would be 63,000 miles high. A stack of $1 bills equal to $19.5 trillion would be 1,228,500 miles, or 5 times the diameter of the moon's orbit around the Earth. Will the national debt be paid? The majority of the trillions of fiat dollars printed under various quantitative easing phases was in the form of bonds, which were purchased by the Federal Reserve Bank. Press memory. It was hoped that the printing of fiat dollars would cause mild inflation. Press memory. As the cost of goods and services increased due to mild inflation, it was hoped that federal revenues from taxes would also. This idea didn't work either. Only the law of supply and demand makes for a sound economy and sound personal finance. It may come as a surprise to many, but the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank of the U.S., is not, repeat, not a federal agency. The Federal Reserve Bank is owned by 14 private banks, some in the U.S. and some in Europe. The interest earned from the bonds purchased under quantitative easing goes to these banks, domestic as well as foreign. So, the seed corn is going to domestic banks and it's going to foreign banks. The history of how the Federal Reserve Bank came about, and the name of the owner bank is easily obtained from the internet. And I would urge you to do a search on the Federal Reserve Bank and read up about its history. It is enough to make you throw up. Facts about about paying the national debt. When people seriously start thinking about the $19.5 trillion national debt, how it will be paid, only when they think about it do they begin to realize the size of the problem and how it may affect them. It seems likely that to pay off the national debt, the government will tax the savings of depositors over a weekend. This scheme occurred previously, and it's done over the weekend because the banks are closed. People can't go withdraw their money. People will say, oh, that couldn't happen. Well, in Cyprus, not very long ago, bank closed on a Friday, and when they opened back up, a lot of depositors who had more than 100,000 euros found that they had 10% deducted from the total amount that they had on a deposit. Instantly, the sovereign debt of Cyprus was paid off. And it so happens that a lot of that money that was there was Russian money. These oligarchs in Russia were looking around, and they know where the places are, as others who are not oligarchs of Russia know where the places are. Panama, you can go down the list. Well, they had their money there, not in Russia, in Cyprus. It reached the uppermost level in the Russian government. People may remember that Putin got up and was bad-mouthing Cyprus government for doing that. Well, Cyprus government told their banks, close on Friday, open on Monday, pay us the 10% of all the deposits, and we're coming around to check. Well, it can happen here through banking regulations that are already in place. Those regulations are called FINRA, and I have a copy of them. Ostensibly, that FINRA regulation was to prevent dope dealers from using large denomination bills for their transaction. But the fact of the matter, and part of that was by restricting the amount of money that you could take out of the United States. And the regulation says, in fact, that you cannot take more than $10,000. If you do, there is a report that's made on you. And if you take it out, if you take out more than that much money, over a period of time, the board of the bank will review these little reports that are made out on you, a little slip of paper about like that. Well, it's to prevent a run on the bank. Prevent a run on the bank. If you got somebody with $5 million cash sitting in a safety deposit, and they're in great unstable financial conditions, going to go down there and try to get his money out of the bank. He's going to get $10,000 every banking day, no more. And if he deposits $10,000, that's $20,000 transaction. See, these things have buzzwords like transaction, not withdrawals or deposits, transactions. So if he engages in a transaction of more than $10,000, it's going to be reported. Well, I'm now reaching the end, and I will say that there's another possibility. That possibility is going to be one that is more subtle. Almost everyone has money, a little money, in savings accounts. individual retirement accounts, Roth IRAs, treasury bills, treasury bonds, and so forth. All of these things will be converted to debt instruments of the United States, worst case. Now, how will they do that? Well, our present president was so happy to announce that we have now available to all the poor folks MIRAs, MyIRA, and they're called MIRAs. So what conceivably could happen is it would cause great upheaval, and doubtful that it would happen, but it could. Well, they could go and take your IRA and say, we now are giving you a promissory note from the federal government. It's called Your IRA, MIRA, MyIRA. And we've taken the cash, and here's a promise to pay. Could happen. The regulations are on the books right now. You could finagle them a little bit and make it happen. Well, these things would be done without the owner's knowledge, without the owner's permission, and certainly without the owner's desire. Yahweh assures us that if we persevere in righteousness, we will be shielded from such dire consequences. And so we must get down on our knees every night and thank the Almighty Yahweh for this promise. Amen.